actually the final lecture of this fall. So it's also a very big personal pleasure to have to introduce Keller Easterling. She was a professor of mine at Columbia University, and I had the opportunity to work for her a bit after that. So it's great to it's great to have you at SCI-Arc, and hopefully we'll all enjoy this. I just had wrote something, and I'm going to try to read it. Often in contemporary discussions and debates within architectural discipline, generalizations are made in order to name theories and events that shape and change the way we understand things. More than often, institutions such as schools undergo those generalizations. Such generalizations occur way too many times in the case of Columbia universities, especially Columbia universities in the 90s. The emergence of digital design, Arsenal, and its dynamic sensibility surely shaped the discipline and changed many of us. This being an assumed fact, it sometimes tends to overshadow another equally significant fact, that many of the changes that incrementally precipitated within design studios would have never existed in such a form and content without the impact of some of the most progressive theories, writers, and their contemporary and historical analysis. Among a group of designers, theorists, and thinkers, there was Keller Easterling, who belonged to all of those categories. With an unusually shy personality, her work was hard to categorize, since she didn't seem to belong to any specific group. Moreover, while many of the theoretical propositions at the moment were coming from a specific European, mostly French, philosophy, Keller's work was drawing examples from American post-war landscape and thinkers. In his famous text, Gilles Deleuze, in the famous text Mediators, wrote, "Mediators are fundamental. Creation is all about mediators. Without them, nothing happens. They can be people, artists or scientists for a philosopher, philosopher or artist for a scientist, but things as well, even plants or animals, as in Carlos Castaneda. Whether they are real or imaginary, animate or inanimate, one must form one's own mediators. It's a series. If you don't belong to a series, even a completely imaginary one, you're lost. I need my mediators to express myself, and they will never express themselves without me." In the case of Keller Easterling's work, what appears to be an isolated approach from a single individual was a rather large coordination of efforts from multiple people over time. Keller had carefully constructed her mediators. She had not only put together a cast of characters from different backgrounds and ideologies, many of them completely outside mainstream, such as Benton McKay, Gregory Bateson, Bel Geddes, Nicolas Negroponte, Alfred Jarry, Bruno Latour, Henry Bergson, Louis Mumford, among many others. In a way, no one has done it before, but she also had made them speak in a style that amounted more to an effective science fiction novel than to a mere factual reality. Her approach was not historical or revisionist, but highly speculative and provocative. Keller was clearly manufacturing deep propositions of herself that resonated even deeper when formulated at unison with the discourses of her predecessors. Those people, their personalities, and their distinctive stories form Keller's own mediators. In the same text, Deleuze continues, "To form your own mediator, you have to catch someone in the act of legending. Catching someone in the act of legending is to catch the movement of constitution of a people." I guess if I can probably say this, catching Keller in the act of legending this evening is to catch the movement of constitution of an intensely original mind and unique body of work, its evolution and potential material reality. Please welcome Keller Easterling.
Thank you. How nice, Marcelo. Thank you. It's very nice to be here. Can you hear me? Well, what a nice introduction, and it's been a while since I've actually been to SCI-Arc. It was the old building when I was here, but nice to be with so many friends. I wanted to say something very simple tonight about believers and cheaters and architecture. When we look at these art cartoon characters of power, I wonder sometimes if we sometimes think their power is negligible because of its absurdity or banality, but it's precisely also because their power exists in the realm of cunning and stupidity and comedy that it interests us. Precisely because our predictable logics are not very good at predicting certain epidemics of belief in the world, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, and we're left sputtering and helpless to explain it. We could say that these characters that you're looking at oscillate between believers and cheaters. And I'm fascinated in the way in which both believers and cheaters achieve a transcendence of sorts that propels them to fame and acceptance. The way in which the stone-cold bluff of the liar and the sunny, long-winded, elegiac aphorism of the believer achieve roughly the same effect, and both much more successful than measure or reason. The righteousness of the believer, the confidence games of the cheater can elude their day of reckoning with a Teflon coating that maintains an exemption from laws or consequences. The believer eludes any day of reckoning because there's only a tautology of belief, a fairy tale musical uncluttered by details. You all remember this summer when Ronald Reagan died, and David Gergen, who's sort of the ultimate pundit courtier, was telling a sort of fond memory of Ronald Reagan, one of his favorite funny stories that he had honed for many Washington cocktail parties. And he was telling about the night before a G7 conference when they'd prepared an enormous briefing book for him, but they didn't want him to spend all night reading it. They were scared that Nancy would be on the warpath because he didn't get enough sleep. But when he came in the next day, he was gray, exhausted, and they were sort of 7 minutes into the eggs, and he said, "Fellas, I have to thank you for preparing that briefing book. You did such a good job. But I turned the TV on last night, and The Sound of Music was on, and that's my favorite musical, and I stayed up really late watching that, so I didn't get a chance to read the briefing book." And David Gergen, the ultimate sort of sycophant, said, "And he was never bitter. He could see the big picture." And that's the perfect little anecdote of the believer. The believer the big picture is always available, because the believer is almost like Hegel's beautiful soul. He exists in a utopia in which just a few convictions are sufficient. The big picture is always unavailable, always uncluttered by any details. He can exist in the perfect solipsism of innocence. And critique can find no traction in this Teflon world. The believer fights only just and righteous wars, and he's capable of the most aggressive gentleness and as well as the most unrelenting righteous violence. For the cheater, who can achieve roughly the same effect, it's important not to tell one lie. It's important to grope, cheat your National Guard service, have affairs on more than one occasion. Again, you only acquire Teflon when there's so many lies that it's difficult to achieve any traction in their reconciliation. Multiple masquerades and fictions continually refresh the original myth, and there's an enormous industry in continually producing myth and fiction. And indeed, without those shifting stories and multiple disguises, fame diminishes. celebrity falls away. But if you look with half-closed eyes at these characters, it's actually difficult to distinguish between the believer and the cheater. And we all oscillate between believing and cheating. We're certainly believers. We are righteous about our own families and ideas and professions and schools, and we will whisper something behind our hand or respin a little fragment of gossip to make ourselves whole, to get rid of an inconvenient bit of information or an inconvenient person, someone who's incompatible with our platform. And regimes and domains on all scales decide what will constitute information. What contradictions or inconvenient populations will simply be eliminated. You change the law that protects someone's dwelling. You put a population in a microwave shadow. Our buildings, while bristling with security systems that absorb data and information, must typically also remain, they must eliminate information that's not compatible, and so for all of their information absorption, remain information poor, remain innocent, righteous. And to desire that state of monism and purity, that's what we might call the violence of remaining intact. But we also oscillate. What often accompanies this righteous lockdown and solipsistic utopia of the believer is also a little bit of cheating. A little game on the side, outside of the borders that you just finished strengthening and polishing. Although trying to maintain only its own information, our organization, the organization, often needs additional help to keep it alive. Husbands and wives feel entitled to an extra husband and wife, or wife. The EU needs younger people to balance out its aging population. Banks need another more pliable currency than the regulated one they have. Corporations need an offshore shelter for their money. Someone's son needs a special privilege, and everyone needs cheap labor. Similarly, just as the believer does a little cheating on the side, similarly the cheater oscillates towards the believer. But this is almost cliche. I mean, invariably one of the favorite masquerades of the cheater is the believer himself. Every great long con is sprinkled with Bible salesmen and naifs and convincing forms of simple sincerity. Remember Melville's confidence man who went, sort of Satan on a steamboat. When he's first spied, he's described as sort of as a snowy white. His whole lamb-like figure relaxed as he lay motionless like some sugar snow in March. So cheating's the secret weapon of the believer, and the believer is the secret weapon of the cheater. They need each other's masquerades. And the composition of these organizations, and of the organizations that I'll talk about tonight, is one in which, through denial and obfuscation, they remain information poor, but do enough cheating to keep themselves alive. Still, architecture is not a politician or a political party. It is surely innocent in this discussion. As lubricating agent of the market, it's not part of the extreme spaces of political consequence, we would say. Architects typically deploy the repertoires of the believers and the cheaters, but only in service of their own careers. They're only running for the president of architecture. They're not engaged in any sort of broader political consequence. They're only trying to use their political craft to become the anointed dauphin of a set of micro-salons that are sprinkled around the world, but they're not actually in the world in that way. You might say that if we go to the sites of warfare, there we would find the space of a political architecture. At battlegrounds, at border crossings, at detention camps, at disasters, where we would be convinced somehow that architecture and planning were engaged in a political project, or even that they were a military apparatus, an apparatus of war. Still, we know that even the most banal space has been a military target, acting as an apparatus or a provocation of war, and we'll never have a broader picture of that than the World Trade Center. But we also see the spaces of tourism and leisure, however difficult that might have been to predict, that they also are targets, provocations of war. Or if we looked at the work of I.L. Weizmann, who, working with B'Tselem, identified settlements along the West Bank as human rights abuse, or we would also be convinced this is engaged in a sort of political issue. Or we might think of the philosopher theorist Giorgio Agamben's analysis of concentration camps as a space of legal exception, a kind of space of declared legally as a kind of space of emergency, a place of lawlessness and atrocity. Concentration camps, yes, we would agree that those are spaces of political consequences, indeed even themselves spaces of war, of the violence of war. But Agamben's argument, for me, becomes all the more compelling when he also argues that the condition of exemption or exception can be naturalized or stabilized as a political paradigm that reappears in, quote, the zone d'attente of our airport and certain outskirts of our cities. He's corroborating what we already know. Agamben suggesting that the architecture of exception made so vivid in detention camps or military bases or border crossings is eerily similar to our own familiar offshore real estate cocktails with their devices for security and territorial conquest. Like any camp or zone of conflict, the next free trade zone or data haven, tax shelter, residential golf development, they too see community as an exceptional condition, a legal lacuna or island that's entitled to some kind of special sovereignty, entitled to polish its borders to keep itself secure, even if it's doing a little cheating on the side. A place so perfect that it's justified in cheating. This very attempt at political quarantine, at exemption from political consequence, is the political consequence. It is a disposition of aggression and exclusion, believing, cheating. A disposition that can be stored or unleashed in its inception, planning, and building, as well as its occupation. So to both implicate and empower architecture, that's just running for the president of architecture, I want to look at the air-conditioned Dubais and Jebel Alis of the architectural soul, spaces that possess the disposition of Ronald Reagans and Clintons and Enrons. I want to look at this strange political content and power, the disposition of the believer and the cheater, that harbors in some of the world's most familiar, even banal spaces. So I've been looking at free trade zones in Dubai, export processing zones in the South China Sea, automated container ports in Hong Kong and Rotterdam, the microwave space of satellites in the Middle East and India and Indonesia, golf courses in China and Kazakhstan, high-tech agriculture in Spain, tourism in North Korea, and the real estate developments of spiritual organizations and commercial organizations, as well as the global demolition industry. So I'm looking at a whole set of seductions and pleasures and excesses found not in the style pages but in the international pages. Also, in this research, given the failures of some of our principled, supposedly authentic political stances, given the failure of those to engage more disorganized, or to use the term of Laschen Urey, disorganized or elusive forms of political subterfuge, given also the resemblance of these righteous and authentic political stances, given the resemblance of those to the righteousness that causes so much violence in the world, I've been looking at these sites as sites that also entertain the cunning of piracy and stupidity, the duplicity of both believers and cheaters themselves, and bringing that back as a tool for us. And so it's tricky. How would one rigorously do this research? There's obviously no comfortable archive. The rigors or precisions of some default research would produce nothing like rigor or precision here, especially since as a Padurai or a Lashin Yuri or a Gamban or Harden Negri or Baumann and others have pointed out, many of our world system organums or center-periphery models, those that have tooled some art and architecture templates for thinking about global politics, might have difficulty finding singular logics or some kind of domineering modernism or postmodernism pushing its ecumenical sign on an authentic locality that must be preserved. I mean, we could chant those things in a room and convince ourselves that that's what was really out there, but of course it isn't. We've also all, you know, the other problem that we have when we get in a room like this is that we've also been in conversations that wish to engage geopolitical issues by applying some of the same research that we've used from digital formalism. And I think that's potentially productive, yet standing flat in front of the computer sometimes doesn't get us there either. Architecture has more to learn than to teach in global studies, but to our work and to the work in other disciplines, I'd like to focus on texts outside our society and on a distinct species of site that I'm calling a spatial product, and on a distinct territory that emanates not from the front but from the back of the computer. So those three things, those are somehow how I've tried to construct some rigor in this kind of very contemporary research. So the texts outside of our society. In other words, not the texts which rehearse or review the things we've done, but I've been reading a wire service for the Korea Times, or statistical tallies for port organizations, or global TV, or orgman manuals and market tracking software, the web chatter, the architectural texts for millions of acres of building and infrastructure around the world. And these accounts, it's tricky to deal with them again, like what constitutes corroboration? What is it that one is reporting? Often what one is reporting is fiction or the presence of fiction. But these accounts provide emotional and hilarious evidence of architectural aspirations that only eventually, if ever, involve the discipline proper. So while it may be very different from the way we reconcile the pedigrees of Bilbaos and boutique hotels to what Banham called our operational lore, I think that evidence always greedily rediscovers or recognizes historiographic, theoretical, and critical techniques and texts. So however contemporary the material, it was only convincing to me when it was an echo of common, sometimes ancient swindles and fantasies. The back of the computer that I was talking about. The front of the computer has held our attention because it dramatizes so well our love of geometry. And that's something that we have, sort of genetic predisposition. It's a mini series of us. As the new, it's both scripts of our beloved geometry and scripts of the avant-garde. It's perfect. It's the perfect little mini series that plays in the front of the computer. But meanwhile. From the nipples and wires and networks, the very device we have in our hands and in our laps, was reciprocally formatting not just, office spaces and computer desks, but gigantic conurbations all around the world. Not just rearranging virtual packets, but creating huge new kinds of formations of global cities. The logics of the computer played out in architecture and urbanism. The materializations of digital capitalism. So, and an architecture of network that doesn't necessarily respond to our geometries with the synergetic cybernetic algorithms of recursive complexity we make up for ourselves. Some of the organizational paradigms rehearsed on the front have completely different political consequences on the back, but potentially return new territories to the operations which we carry on in the front. So it's not a choice between, but a way of finding territories for ourselves in both. I say that because I've often been accused of somehow being a dangerous non-formalist, as if that were possible, or as if, I think it's a testament to the smallness of our little world, that you sort of believe in Jesus or you don't, not that you could just have no feeling about it. Another species of site, I said I was sort of three things. The other species of site that I want to add, a site with different parameters to those that we might engage with our form making, and our selections about shape and position, might be what I've been calling spatial products. So different from the deliberately authored building envelope, spatial products like resorts or information technology campuses or retail chains, golf courses, ports, other enclave formations that I've been looking at, they index the world by marketing or scheduling protocols that presumably avoid the political consequences of location. Spatial products are a kind of software, and the coordinates of this software are not measured in latitude and longitude, but in a kind of orgman. I'm using Rosenberg's nickname for mid-century orgman, but updated, a kind of new orgman. The parameters of these sites are expressed in a kind of orgman argot of acronyms and stats, annual days of sunshine, 20-foot equivalent units, tonnage, layovers, frontage of golf courses, time that it takes to shop, time that it takes to play golf, labor costs. Data streams are the levers of spatial manipulation, and the new orgman, who's heir to Harold Rosenberg's character, has a kind of frontier enthusiasm for this abstract territory, derives a pioneering sense of creation about making space from these kinds of parameters. From a labor cost, a time zone, a desire that can generate a distinct form of urban space, even a distinct species of global city. These are sort of site plans of this kind of game with time, which we also have a history of taking those parameters and playing with them from the front of the computer, making them into envelope, which probably is pretty meaningless. In a field of houses like this one, we would not alter any single envelope or enclosure. That would not do very much. But we would rather see the architecture as an almost agricultural set of procedures that sequence a set of operations, like a summation over houses or a function of a set of building procedures. Strands of infrastructure, too, can be enjoyed for their remote effects, their switches, redundancies, sensitive surface areas that model a much larger repertoire from a smaller maneuver. These are sites which are intensely spatial and with very specific formal needs, but they're exciting in the sense that they're multiplied, that their responses are more relational, more algebraic, more like a function in calculus, where one enters a relationship with ramifying effects that one can't always control. Space and sight in this multiple active register also alters what we consider to be authorship in architecture and urbanism. And I know this would make, I think this would make some people very sad, but I find it very relaxing. These are the organizational logics about which Manuel Castells writes, the techno-scientific semiotics about which Felix Guattari writes. And while architects often treat them as banal or unresponsive to some recognized systems of architectural language, since often an architectural enclosure is only the byproduct of these data streams, yet what I've been trying to say in this new work, they are by their abstraction no less hyperbolic, volatile, extravagant, ridiculous, hilarious, when adopted by rogue nations and cults and diplomats and other impresarios. Even the most perfunctory spatial products are imbued with myths, desires, and symbolic capital. They're filled with comedies and psychological weaknesses and cunning. Many of these real estate cocktails are warm pools for urbanism and for all kinds of global contagions, program contagions that are spreading around the world. They may gain entry into any situation, freighted with their desires, sporting their global currency and all of their duty-free costumes and fake epaulets. These are the hilarious and dangerous masquerades of retail and business trade that often mix incredibly easily with the cunning of political platforms. They possess stupidity. Remember Avital Ronell's book, Stupidity, in which he cautions us that the stupidest thing would be to discount stupidity. That's the other thing, I guess, we learned 2 weeks ago. But I would argue that this spatial software is not only an indexical or functional expression, but that they also possess what Agamben would call face, or what Scott Lash might call, not the light signs of semiotics, but a kind of heavy information of meaning in an active register, symbology in an active register. Moreover, because they are recipes for organization, they are also recipes for political constitution. They possess persuasion. They possess aggression. They possess the masquerades of the believers and cheaters that I want to look at. So while architecture may have more to learn than to teach, also I think the study of these kinds of cocktails may contribute evidence of mechanisms of the market that are as good as economic indicators of the market's weakness and resilience and violence. You can see that there is phase here. So I'd like to talk about a small subset of this work in just looking at 3 different sites. And you'll know when I'm passing from one site to another because of these convenient numbers that will appear. These are also all sites that I've used as some kind of test bed with students, in the sense of students who invited me, which makes me very, very proud. These are also somehow ancillary comments about an experiment in design, which I think lets me know that maybe there's so much more to think about that's only been touched on in the studios that have accompanied this textual research. So one of the worlds I want to show you is part of a sea of photosynthesis. It's a world of high-tech agriculture that's spreading around the globe, annexing locations that have abundant sunshine and cool winds and cheap labor. Just as tourism territorializes a kind of belt of air that has certain color of sand and a certain water temperature and a certain air temperature, we could look at pools of satellites that move around the world like weather fronts. We could look at a number of these kinds of seas, seas of water, seas of oil, seas of natural gas, seas of photosynthesis, that become coveted or embattled territories. So there, in all of these three examples, I think there are these kind of belts of special conditions that are like a kind of airborne or landed maritime current. And also in each case, I've called them worlds or seas because they like to maintain their own utopias. They like to expand and exclude, extend and tighten, broaden but become more taut at their boundaries. So in this sea of photosynthesis, this is a map of photosynthesis. In this sea of photosynthesis, the Rome or Alexandria of this world is El Ejido in southern Spain. Here, it's really Europe's only desert. It's where the Sergio Leone filmed his spaghetti westerns. But now it's covered with plastic greenhouses for 200 square miles in a formation that grows the cherry tomatoes, the off-season cherry tomatoes that we eat. An underground aquifer together with 3,000 hours of sunshine annually and all kinds of automated systems to deliver nutrients. This has become an error-free, perfect utopia. Spain colonizes the sea of photosynthesis, and it's optimized every aspect of tomato growth in a kind of vegetable urbanism, kind of agripole. It's as intense and waste-producing as any other form of urbanism, really. In fact, the new urban regulations for this area, which sound almost like turn of the century laws in any major city, that like in New York, that created the new law tenement, except for here, the urban reform laws regulate the life of the vegetable and not the life of the illegal North African workers who also live in these areas, live in scraps made of the greenhouses, in charbolos made of the greenhouses themselves. The mirroring shores of Spain and North Africa have long engaged in this kind of symmetrical entrenchment. I'm borrowing the word symmetrical from Gregory Bates. It doesn't matter, I won't go through but to say symmetrical, imagine two almost identical daughters, twin sisters, both strangling and smacking each other and stroking each other. You know, it's a kind of an escalating violence that has to do with mimicry and competition. And since Ferdinand and Isabella, there have been expulsions of Jews and Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula and pirate retaliations from Tangiers and Saleh on the North African side, from the pirate enclaves of North Africa. Maintaining their symmetrical entrenchment and righteousness, the good farmers of good Catholic breeding in southern Spain routinized weekend KKK-style raids on the illegal North Africans while simultaneously relying on them for the labor in those greenhouses. They polished their boundaries, hardened their own boundaries, while looking the other way and cheating a little bit on the outside of those boundaries. The lockdown on the boundaries and the engagement in an outside deal, that's the believers and cheaters. And like many organizations that wish to maintain their righteousness, they remain information poor, but still needing some extra thing, however unacknowledged that extra thing may be, to keep them alive. It's the sense of any organization, genetics, circuitry, Mendel's peas, the mutations, errors, extra strata, species of information make sturdier mongrels. So organizations take in unexplained phenomenon, they just don't acknowledge them. Those things are waved in while one is chanting loudly about dogma and the purity of your blood and the nation and so on. And tourism is a natural partner to these greenhouses. In fact, because it's the Costa del Sol somewhere here, don't know if I can point. Somewhere here, you can't get a cherry tomato, but you can get like a Wiener Schnitzel in this area. Yet near Mini Hollywood, Mini Hollywood is a theme park to commemorate the Sergio Leone westerns. In this very rich vein of photosynthesis is also a solar experiment with very different politics. The Plataforma Solar de Almería in Europe's, in the EU's most extensive solar installation. Another experiment near Manzanares, 15 kilometers south of Madrid, you've all seen this now, rehearses the essential principle of greenhouse design for energy collection rather than horticulture. And you know, much larger versions of this are being planned. They suck the hot air into these gigantic turbines, and many people, Jörg Schleck has designed this. So why am I showing you this? It's just that in these sites of violent disposition, human rights abuse, environmental abuse, the first impulse is classic resistance and organization through the same mechanisms of labor. What would architects do? Housing, or something like that, right? Which would, of course, create the real concentration camp. That would be the real tool of containment here. But just as one thinks of those classical responses in this utopia, I'm wondering if we might have the stomach for architecture by ricochet or remote. If we too were sneaky, modulating and intervening in patterns of the believers and cheaters. If one thinks again about algebraic sites, or what I've been calling germs, the plastic germ that was unleashed in this area that cultivated almost 200 square miles of greenhouses, on the one hand, it represents a massive exploitation of resources, yet it also hallucinates the spread of a contagion of any kind, a contagious detail that's in this case intensely interactive with climate, one that might, under different circumstances, possess an alternative intention or relationship to the sun. I think architects in studios and so on that we've done with you, architects see sites like these and they get ideas about, 200 tons of plastic, 200,000 tons of plastic a year, about plastic, about food, about migrations, about labor. And just as we cannot predict the epidemics of belief, it may be a sort of counter germ that travels somewhere else and does not fulfill our regrettable urges to reform and correct. Rather, we might see these inventions, or any invention like this, as a kind of exploitation that could tip the fulcrum towards very different political, environmental issues, using the same huge dose of sunshine. Another way to cheat that doesn't involve human rights abuse in the one instance, another way to cheat that lasts for a little while until someone finds another way to cheat in one moment for some time until the next time. Another world of the believers and cheaters that I wanted to show you is the logistics conurbations of global trade. Just because maybe there's no better, there may be no better example of that kind of architecture behind the screen or sort of clearer, more cartoon example of the architecture behind the screen than looking at these conurbations of global trade. You know now that 95% of the world's goods travel on the sea. The sea is a favorite metaphor for neoliberals and radicals, but from the neoliberals, it's a frictionless one-world place. From the radicals, it's often used as part of an epic monistic world system organum that attends a broader globalization theory, one which naturally, in order to contend with Marx, mimics the great sort of tragic scale of it. So there is, on the one hand, a kind of one world naturalization of the market, but also in Hart and Negri's Empire or Multitude, the portrayal of the possibility of something approaching univocal, if not classic, political upheaval. And I hope that as I tell you about these kind of taught worlds, that you'll see that I am not interested in any of these kinds of one world global systems, either on the neoliberal side or on the radical side. I hope you'll see that that we are talking about not also kind of genial mix of global scapes, as Appadurai might describe. Rather, I'm focusing on their fierce segregation, because for me there's more traction in insisting on this multiplied condition that knows nothing about a unity or a totality, nothing about a great maritime immensity. But what it seems to me when looking at these organizations is that there are only multiple monotheisms fighting to be the dominant platform, demanding compatibility from everything else. No empire, but empires. One has to add an S, I think, finally. Even recognizing how the word is used as a pervasive condition. No global village, but global villages. No one world, but many segregated worlds with their own fierce logic. No one in the many, but only the many. There may be, as I say, no more clearer materialization of digital capitalism that's on the network side of the computer than these what we might call parks or distriparks in the Orgman patois. They cluster around seaports, but they're also inland, next to airports, free trade zones, UPS, FedEx hubs. Global trade is, as we know, not accomplished by virtual packets of information, but it's heavy and huge. Container ports and distribution conurbations cover tens or hundreds of kilometers. Inland distribution parks that are 65 to 100 square miles in size. They're not sited in their locality, but positioned within a global network of similar enclaves, serviced by autonomous infrastructure and a kind of slippery space between jurisdictions. These are the SEZs, FEZs, FTZs of the world, with streamlined customs and taxes in, I guess the broadest way to call them is special economic zones. While some notions of the global city are confined to kind of financial global city, New York, Sao Paulo, London, Tokyo, the new conurbations of the park are forming a species of global city that we might call the logistics city. And if the elevator was the kind of vertical germ of the global city as financial city, it's these little devices, these little things here, AGVs or automated guided vehicles that are the germ of a kind of horizontal spread of gigantic fields of containers that are continually, obsessively sorting contents. They're part of a choreographed ballet of waiting and carrying, moving slowly, driverless at 11 miles an hour in these landscapes, responding to transponders in the ground. And I'll just lift from this world one kind of organizational paradigm to illustrate it. For instance, the ways in which these basically they're sort of robotic organizations, organizational paradigms like greedy heuristics that control AGVs. I'll use that to talk about how these work technically, but also to reflect a political disposition of the logistics orgman and his park Landschaft. Heuristics are sort of rules and choices along a pathway, and greedy heuristics are the optimal selection from among those choices. Greedy algorithms solve problems by taking the next step based on local knowledge alone. And there's not a larger plan, but these little devices, when they get to a crossroad, decide what is the most advantageous situation and then take it. It's a moment-to-moment recognition of advantageous patterns. You can see that these are some of the late 20th century organizational paradigms that we've used for form, but which in this conversation, for the purpose, for a little while, we'll transpose them to site, transpose to network, to relational space, about which we spoke earlier. So the logistics oligarch, when he talks about these paradigms, he's a sort of soft oligarch, presiding, this is Kevin Kelly's word, it's a soft world, presiding over a world of connectivity that is constantly but only gently learning and adjusting. It provides an illusion of differentiation in what is really a very recursive and controlled organization. It naturalizes the market with a redemptive overlay of complexity. Soft has become a frequent suffix or prefix in corporate names in the marketplace, while operating under the guise of plenitude or any one of these other sort of popular contemporary organizational paradigms. The orchestration of populations in transshipment is also a reductive desire for monistic control. In greedy heuristics, all the manifold contingencies must not have needs or demands. The org man must make no commitment to them. He determines his temporary loyalties and attentions in response to information that must wait on decisions of the control organization. You will all be my friend, but you must wait until I decide when I would like to see you. The greedy heuristics of the AGV algorithm also extends in the scale to the politics of the South China Sea, to the archipelagos that are circulating cars and athletic shoes between one cheaper labor population between differentials of currency. So the org man who's manipulating supply chains and material handling, they want information. They want just-in-time information. That's the ethos, that it's information rich, so that they're able to correlate stock and timing and price. The cartoon of this now would be radio frequency ID, where Walmart, the first one to really demand this of suppliers, can, because of their volume, require that their suppliers now ramp up to have radio frequency ID in all of their products so that they can maintain control over all of them. And yet, it's a sort of chilling degree of control, isn't it, since what that allows them to do is find errors in the suppliers who are serving them. It's like an ancient form of piracy that all maritime cities have engaged in. The contemporary logistics park is an open fortress of sorts that orchestrates controlled and advantageous cheating. It's a complex game of filling quotas, of circumventing labor restrictions, finding favorable logistics. And architecture will not address the problems of global labor in export processing zones. So many of those things are now going to courts, or they will, if they go at all. And one of the chilling things maybe also about this research is that, when I start from that juncture of Agamben, talking about concentration camps, there is probably more international law addressing how we deal with detention camps than there is addressing how we deal with labor in these kinds of special economic zones. But still, this is a field for ingenious thinking. These funny AGVs are currently recombining the repertoires of cars, elevators, and robotics. They're behaviors that were originally conceived for human transport, but they were best rehearsed in, there's a dog. But they were best rehearsed with cargo, because cargo has this very repetitive set of tasks. So they're germs just like the elevator, with the power to travel through a landscape at incredible speed, creating incredible epidemics. And they are also making of buildings, automatic buildings, where these devices read the floor. And if you know, I mean, you've been following things like the Odyssey elevator, you know, this is no longer operating, but there are many, many versions of this now, merging the repertoires of elevator, of car, and robotics in a way that could radically change what we regard as or make building an envelope into navigable surface in a way that's very different from the way we think of it now. So a huge field of invention and ingenuity here, that if we were to look at it a different way, to think about sending the germs into a different kind of epidemic. In a way, these thickenings of an interstate system, the things that we didn't have in the interstate, the switches and changes that we didn't have in the interstate that we built at mid-century, are this is a sort of reprehensible place, perhaps, because it's switching the things made in maquiladoras of naphtha. This is a place in Texas. Yet one can tip the fulcrum in a slightly different way. And these devices are really strange, anachronistic, continuation of a long-standing dream. Contrary to what we might think, often the functionalist logistical substrate of these organizations is often saturated with fairy tales, bizarre, ecstatic utopias. Reagan's Sound of Music is a common moment in the work that I've been doing. And a broad cartoon and a story, this is the last one I'll show you, a broad cartoon and a story that really started this project in 1999 or 1998 was Hyundai's cruise ship tourism called the I Love Cruise. As part of the, some of you may have seen this work, as part of the South Sunshine policy, Hyundai ran a cruise ship tour with karaoke and dancing girls to Mount Kumgang, which was Korea's spiritual equivalent of Mount Fuji, unseen by North Koreans since 1945. The tourists stayed in a floating hotel, hiked through mountains with guards stationed at intervals, their hair frozen in mid-century hairdos. The compound is fenced off as a special kind of tourist zone into which North Koreans may not go. Tourists, though, can see the failing villages just beyond on the other side of the fence from their tour buses. They used to be fined if they tried to throw food over the fence. And all along the hiking routes and carved into the mountains, written into the scripts of the tour guides, are the poems of Kim Jong-il, who's the North's oxymoronic, the leader of the North's oxymoronic communist dynasty, someone who, you all know this now, someone who likes Tom and Jerry cartoons and Paul Anka music. Also carved into the stones are the aphorisms of Juche, North Korea's philosophy of self-reliance. Juche combines the political dictates of Stalinism, of Confucianism, also a kind of neo-Christian story, kind of the basic outlines of missionary Christianity. It's the perfect cartoon of this kind of solipsistic world. It is an uber utopia a political tautology, and its perfection inspires of its followers a kind of really ecstatic joy, a kind of agitated righteousness, and it's coached them through grinding poverty. I think the closest thing we would have to experiencing this would be to sort of go to Bob Jones University or something and spend a week there with fundamental Christians, or maybe the mega churches that form a kind of compound and have televised the worship services and so on. Now the tourist compound includes Gucci and Prada stores. New additions also include dancing bears in fuzzy costumes to greet the new guests, as well as polystyrene tigers and bears that are placed in the mountains, bears appearing to fish from the warm pools that have drawn people there for hundreds of years. As a recent group completed their tour, the staff expressed its farewells by singing aloud to a kind of Soviet loudspeaker broadcasts of the Everly Brothers song "Bye Bye Love." The North was to extort several $100 million in the deal. Chung Ju-young, head of Hyundai, was going to develop the entire eastern seaboard with SeaWorlds and theme parks, Hilton-style hotels, a railroad, oil wells. There was captive, cheap labor. Both sides were sort of in this kind of happy pastel sentiments to accompany this sort of steamroller gentleness. All aggressions on both sides trying to get what they wanted. Two telling details of the tour were that Kim Jong-il and his top officials requested from Hyundai 30,000 25-inch color television sets that were newly branded they couldn't be branded with a kind of regular Hyundai or Sony label. They had to say Kumgang-san on them. And the other telling detail was that the cruise ship that was used in the tour was the actual Island Princess, the very ship that was used in the Love Boat television series, and that launched kind of mass market. That TV show made cruising into a mass market phenomenon. So in this bizarre handshake between the logics of shamanism, Confucianism, communism, neo-Christian mythology, Juche, capitalism, there's a peculiar sort of mutual attraction between the DPRK and tourism that exposes the political disposition in both worlds. The optimized format of the world of cruising was a kind of solvent to the fairy tales of communism and free market on both sides. And it was also a solvent to the anachronistic cults of modernity that were accompanying. You saw the sort of peculiar Hilton hotels. Tourism generates a kind of symbolic capital, not because the comedy of its fake crests and seals and fake epaulets actually means something, but precisely because there's a tacit agreement that they mean nothing. So absurdist gestures and cultural gibberish are technique in tourism's sleight of hand. It's the way they float is a whole set of irreconcilable motives over a revenue stream that's very good at doing that. Not only do tourism and totalitarianism utilize the same tools of mental vacuity, they become, in this case, each other's next masquerade, each other's good costume. The fact that both masquerades require the complete obfuscation of meaning is maybe not the tragedy of meaninglessness. It's the meaning and opportunity for political leverage. Those fairy tale moments, for instance, that in Debord we might have thought, treated as something tragic, are the moments of political instrumentality. While the fairy tale of belief is chanted loudly, the deal is made on the side. And one of the most reclusive states on Earth is penetrated by a promiscuous cruise ship tour. Finally, it was also where the Red Cross met, where there were summit meetings. The DPRK story crystallizes some ideas, but it's in no way unusual in all of this work. 5 minutes of TV will produce the same misty stories, the stories of banks and ATMs and nuclear energy companies, Maharishis, gurus, golfers, all with the sort of ritual vestments of retail loyalties, bearing some mark of a fairy tale of belief. A fairy tale of belief that is the perfect masquerade for cheating. Well, the last thing I'll say is that while expertise usually involves circling the wagons around a particular discipline or skill, I suppose that this research field would want to admit to knowing nothing, knowing no prescription, knowing only multiple solutions. The organizational architecture that we've been talking about, both in the self-reflexive worlds under discussion and in the way we organize our own work, is less violent when it's not reductive but multiplied, not information poor but information rich. Obvious, but somehow not so obvious. The material collected here should then train or nourish a special kind of political imagination. You can't trust the classic indicators of political contention. Cheaters come dressed as believers. Capital comes dressed as its resistance. Empire and counter-empire swimming in the same water and using the same tools. Capital's contradictions don't cause its tragic downfall. They are, if there are enough of them, the reason why they succeed. Attempts to secure political exemption may paradoxically land an organization in the crosshairs of the conflict they thought they had banished. All these things seem to be fulcrums that are just tipping constantly in several different directions. So I want to describe not only the classic political stance that declares its name in a democratic process, but other politics as well that rely on fiction or corruption or stupidity. Politics savvy enough not to square up to the fight with the direct righteous confrontation, but with a germ or ricochet from another vantage point, one whose trajectory we can only partially control. Relinquishing the architect's monologue of sincerity and innocence, we might study the ethical masquerades of the double agent or the non-believer who engages in the market patterns of cheating and long con. Perhaps the material favors those people who are too smart to be right and who wish to replace our innocence with ingenuity. Thank you. Do you usually have questions, or you don't? Are there questions? I can't see you. That's why.
I have a question. First of all, I would say very much appreciate I like the way in which it's opposed to producing information just organic maybe what we could call a movement from mechanical consolidated my question has to do with the sort of behavior of organizing in a certain sort of way, the social sector that gets narrativized one way or another. The spatial product, let's say, the organism, are consumables, keep themselves with air quotes, the spaces itself is product. These spaces, though, are obviously organized by just on the highest perhaps precisely the steps in which logistic it makes it possible. So as opposed to being this sort of mindless cybernetic kind of emotion, highly cultured, highly affect the blood process. The question I have to do is sort of the program, which is something this sort of triangulation between architectural program, one way, and territorial relationship are possible. Political program, which may involve the kind of legitimating the expectation of those things, and then sort of what is the vocabulary in a way for projecting also constipating something to be some kind of counter-territory where they take it out?
Yeah, no, it's true, because I don't use the word program, except well, almost never, just because of the freight that it carries with us, and because it's bound in a way. Although I like very much this sort of triad that you make. Certainly looking at the Transhipa landscape, that's very clear well, there isn't, I suppose you could say there is a program that architects to the word program. There's certainly spatialization of computer program. What's the thing? Oh, the political program, which is here kind of unconsciously played out, because this is a world that's telling itself it has no politics. It's managed to use the perfect thing to get rid of all laws and any consequence. So it is that is a good way to talk about that triad. But I think that is the reason why I've resisted using that word in an architecture world. Because it seems that somehow swimming in between that triad, want to restrict it to the triad of reading that peculiar space, reading the peculiar persuading aspect of these organizations, which is potentially the place of their connectability for us. And if I think about what that persuasion or connectability would be, I think it could be a program too. But it would be a program that brings with it a very Buchananian set of persuasions. Is that very long? That gives me time.
I don't know what that is. Great.